Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Our presentation is called The View from Somewhere, Institutional Values in Collections Decisions. My name is Danielle Walker. I'm a collections librarian at the U.S. Patents and Trademarks Office in Alexandria, Virginia. Formerly, I was an assistant professor and agricultural sciences information specialist at Purdue University. I'm joined by my colleagues from Purdue, Heather Howard, an associate professor and business information specialist, and also David Zwicky, also an associate professor and chemical information specialist. And just as a disclaimer, all of our opinions expressed in this presentation and on the following slides are solely those of the presenters and not necessarily their employers. So why is this necessary? Why do we want to think about our collections, well, our values in relation to the business decisions that we make? Well, there's no denying that the events of the last year and a half, almost 2 years, have been very disruptive, cataclysmic in some ways, definitely devastating. I'm referring to the pandemic and also the reckoning that we had on race and justice within the last year. So people are starting to think and have conversations in their institutions, where they work, their daily life, about how they think about the world and how they interact with it and the decisions that we make. As we have had discussions about this at our institution, we started to think about how would we scrutinize those values and these standards that we value and connect them with our business decisions, especially around collections. We all know that we put quite a bit of our budgets into these decisions. In most cases, almost all of our budgets go into collections and the things that we purchase and acquire for our patrons. So what are our partners in the publishing world? What do they value? Does it align with the things that we value, that we pour our treasure into? So instead of just wondering about it, we decided to test it. But first, we needed to take a look at our strategic plan and see what those values were. So at Purdue, we have a new strategic plan, and this is what we value. We value innovation, where we encourage new ideas and creative approaches in all we do. We also value collaboration. We work together with campus and others to find solutions. Agility, embracing change and swift, nimbly to meet emerging needs. We value equity. We advance access, diversity, inclusion, and a sense of belonging. We also value stewardship. We thoughtfully harness and leverage our human and financial resources for maximum impact. And we value service. We gladly share our knowledge and expertise with Purdue students, faculty, and staff, and beyond.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about how we make a rubric in this context. Well, so in order to translate our institution's values into something that we can actually use to answer questions and to assess something, we need to capture those values and turn them into a rubric. So we found it was a three-step process. First, finding all of the relevant institutional values at the various levels of the organization that should be taken into account. And then what do each of those values mean in a collections context? Danielle just mentioned a variety of different things that we value as a library, but okay, what does innovation translate to in our context? And then for each of those, what are we actually going to be testing? What are we actually going to be assessing? So in terms of finding institutional values, first we needed to figure out what levels we were looking at. For our particular test case here, we were looking at our library's institutional values and our university's institutional values. So from the libraries, we have the list that Danielle just mentioned. From the university, we found an official statement of values, the We Are Purdue statement, which is essentially aligned pretty well with the library's values, but there were a few different things that we wanted to take into account. And I would also want to mention that if we were doing this in a different context, we would have additional stakeholders that we might need to take into account. So, I'm a chemistry librarian. If I was doing this just for a chemistry library, something like safety might be a value that chemistry's departmental statement of values would indicate, but that wouldn't show up for, say, a business library. So that basically left us with this. This is mostly from the library's statement of values, but we added integrity and honor, which sort of captured the bits of the university's values that we couldn't align exactly with the libraries. So all this is great. Now, how do we translate that to collections? Well, we did a lot of brainstorming, and this is basically what we came up with for our specific context. For collaboration, is the publisher collaborating with librarians, with authors, with researchers? For agility, what are they doing in crisis situations? And I think, the last couple of years have been a crisis situation. Equity, how are they addressing concerns about equity, diversity, and inclusion? And importantly, how are they dealing with accessibility? For integrity and honor, what are their business practices? What is their impact on society overall? For innovation, how are they adapting to changing technologies, to new technologies as they come up? For stewardship, how are they changing their pricing, their rates as time goes on? How are they treating their employees? What is their sort of social responsibility aspect to it? And then service, what is the flexibility for on-site users, for distance users? How are they serving their community, and how are they helping us serve our community? So we've got these things that we're looking at. We need things to actually test, things to actually look up. So we made a rubric, and this is the completely unreadable version. And Heather is now going to be going through piece by piece.
All right, good morning. So how to use this rubric that we made that you could not read on that last slide. One, I suggest highly planning to have a lot of conversations with a lot of different people, right? You cannot do this alone. The reason I'm on our team is because I'm a business librarian. So I am quite good at company research. A lot of the things that we've found, I don't know that we could have found without that skill set, right? Additionally, a lot of this information comes maybe from conversations with other libraries, your past experience with a vendor, what your contract terms look like, right? So I'm going to go through each phase of this and show you how we found these pieces of information. So for the first category, innovation, to align with our values, we determined that a vendor needed to have an updated platform and content, willingness to look at things like transformative agreements, different types of contracts and funding models, and be responsive to changing technical needs. So not just accessibility, but also mobility, right? How does this platform work in different modalities? So we were able to find this type of information through platform evaluation, right? With a vendor that we've had a relationship with over time, you can kind of see how it has adapted. If you don't have a current contract, if it's a new contract that you're looking at, of course, get a demo, but also talk to other librarians who have been subscribing to them. We're all friends, right? We love talking to other librarians. That's why we're here at a conference. Also, maybe talk to your rep, right? Talk to the vendor rep, see what they have to say about how the platform's changed over time, how the content has changed over time. Collaboration, we determined that this aligns with values when a vendor has an advisory board, ideally with librarian input. They're open to consortial negotiation. They have reasonable copyright terms for the authors, and they're willing to go in on research projects with faculty and staff from an institution as well. And again, these are just, they don't have to meet every one of these in order to score well on the rubric. This is just some of things that we have identified. So you find this type of information, one, on a company website, right? You can find often example copyright terms for people wanting to publish with a specific journal or vendor. You can look at your contract, right? What are the terms written in there? Again, talk to other libraries, talk to other librarians, see what their experiences have been. And again, conversations with vendor reps, right? We don't want to do this in a vacuum, and they would be the easiest way to find out, like, hey, do you have an advisory board? Yes or no, right? That's going to be a lot easier than trying to dig around the website, things like that. So definitely make this participatory with multiple parties. Agility, we determined that to align with our values, we needed flexibility when presented with a crisis. As Dave mentioned, and Danielle mentioned, the last few years have been a real good example of a crisis, right? A lot of us had budget cuts, but expanded information needs. How did this vendor work with us during this time? But this doesn't necessarily just mean the pandemic, right? We saw some really helpful and generous moves by vendors and publishers after hurricanes, for example, right? So what is their willingness to do that? And then also, what's their willingness to embrace new trends in scholarship responsibly? I think we can also all think of some vendors who have embraced new trends too quickly and too much and too expensively, right? So that's the type of thing that we're looking at there as well. So the information sources for this, one, prior experience with the vendor, of course. How have they dealt with us over time? Evaluating their content, right? So looking through at what new things they've added over time. Are they expanding their subject area? What's that looking like? Again, the contract, talking to other librarians, and talking with vendor reps. Equity, here's where it gets a little bit trickier in finding this information, right? It's been relatively straightforward so far. Accessibility, we want them to not just meet the WCAG compliance, we would like them to exceed and always be trying to do the best job they can, not just to be compliant, but because they want people to be able to access these resources. But also, do they have an actionable EDI policy or statement, right? So how are they treating their people? You can find some of this on company websites, right? Like often a company will list an EDI statement on the website. You can see information about that. You can also do news searches, right? And again, here, if you look down at the does not align with values, maybe we're looking for lawsuits too, right? Something to think about there. So in terms of finding that company information, you could do a news search. You could do Nexus, Uni, Westlaw, that sort of thing to see if there have been any egregious lawsuits that you need to know about. For platform accessibility evaluation, of course, you can do your own. I will call out here the libraryaccessibility.org testing page. They go through a lot of different platforms to see if they are accessible and compliant. Not everyone is on there, but it's a good place to start and see if they've already done this work for you. And then when you're looking for information on that company, their annual reports can be a really good place to go for this. And again, this is where you want to get a business librarian involved, right? Maybe same for that Nexus Uni type of searching. Edgar is a public source of annual reports. You don't need a subscription to do that, but it's not quite as user-friendly as if you do have one of these other ones. So Mergent, S&P Capital IQ, D&B Hoovers, these are all great places to try and find annual reports. And often companies will put things in annual reports that they're doing that they don't necessarily have on their website. So if you can't find an EDI statement, you can't find any information about that. If you look at their annual report to shareholders, that's where they're going to be bragging about the things that they do well and the things that they're proud about. So you might find something there that you don't find somewhere else. Stewardship, what we mean by this, is there a fair rate of price increases and flexibility with budget crunches? We obviously know that the prices have to increase, right? Your vendors or companies trying to make money, totally understandable. Prices, sadly for us, can't stay flat over time. So are those increases fair? Is there transparency at that company in employee pay equity, right? How are they treating their people? Looking at company investments and lobbying, right? Are they being socially responsible with the money that we are giving them? And this is also where it gets kind of interesting to look into this sort of thing. So, of course, with some of this prior experience, renewal information, conversations with libraries can help you find that price increase information. Glassdoor is a great resource to see if maybe there are some employees who are really unhappy with things like pay equity. Conversations with vendor reps can be a good place to get this kind of information as well. How is the company treating people? Charleston's a great place for this kind of conversation. Again, company annual reports, right? What have they made any public statements about how they have maybe addressed pay equity over time, right? That sort of thing. Salesforce, while not necessarily a library publisher, did this very publicly, got a lot of really good press for this. They did a self-analysis and they found that they were not paying people equitably across the gender gap. And they fixed it, and they fixed it publicly, right? So has this company done something like that? Again, looking at those annual reports. In terms of those investments, that's again where you really should probably get a business librarian involved. These are a little bit trickier to find. You can find this information in S&P Capital IQ investment data. Fun fact, when we were doing some test searches on this to start with, there's a publisher that owns a gold mine. What are you doing? Why do you have a gold mine? So thought that was interesting. But just again, determining like where are they spending the money that you're giving them? Are they being socially responsible with where they are making their investments? And then news searches again as well. And integrity and honor. So do they demonstrate ethical business practices? And is their impact on society generally positive, right? So what is their worldview? What are they doing in terms of making things better, right? Are they doing, community service activities, improving the community? And again, you can find this through ways we've talked about already. But again, those annual reports, those investor reports, actually, I haven't mentioned those. These are third-party reports that are done by companies to determine if it's a good call to invest in a company, right? And there's a lot of good analysis in those as well that can be a great place to look. So again, get your business librarian involved in these conversations. And finally, I want to say that this rubric does not stand alone. We're not suggesting this be the end all be all for how we evaluate our contracts, but we were finding that these were conversations we were already having just with anecdotal information, right? Like I'm sure we all have vendors who are nice to work with and vendors who are much more difficult, right? Like as librarians. And we don't often quantify that or have anything beyond just a general conversation around a table. So this is a way to standardize those conversations, making sure that we're being fair to everyone by looking at the same sorts of criteria and having the same sorts of conversations with all of these contracts. It's meant to be a conversation tool, and it's not meant to be prescriptive, right? Like, oh, you failed in this category, so we're not going to renew. Well, what if my school absolutely needs that resource and there's no other option? We're going to renew, right? Like, let's be reasonable about that. But it does have it allows us to start a dialogue both amongst ourselves and with these companies that we have partnerships with. Now I'm going to hand it over to Danielle to talk about how we use this.
So we had 2 test cases using our rubric. One, the first one that I'm going to talk about is a small private company. And just going through the 7 values that we found, we measured. And so we used a good, mid, and poor point, basically, to keep it simple to see where they landed. And for our small private company, in the area of innovation, they were just above the midpoint. We found some open access content. The platform was functional. And we found one example of a transformative agreement. In the area of collaboration, although we couldn't find any information about an advisory board, we did find some consortial negotiation, as well as standard copyright agreements. So this kind of kept it there in that midpoint. Around agility, they were not scored, but we found that they fell into our good range because they did make health sciences information related to COVID-19 freely available during the pandemic. But in the area of equity, we found they fell really short because we couldn't find anything regarding accessibility. We used the Totally tool to check the WCAG compliance and found a few minor issues with headings, but overall it did seem accessible. No EDI language on the website. And we did find a bad EDI review online. In the area of stewardship, also, we found this company did very poorly. We based this partly on our own experience with dealing with this particular company. There's been a history of large percentage increases, and in some cases, they've been difficult to deal with in terms of negotiation in the past. Also, middling to poor reviews on Glassdoor by their employees. In the area of service, in our own experience, limited flexibility in negotiating license terms. So it also fell within the poor range for us. And lastly, in integrity, we couldn't really find any information. This is a private company. There's a lack of transparency regarding company values on the website. Little to no info on Mergent, Privco, and S&P Capital IQ. So one of the issues that you're probably going to have with these private companies is that it's just going to be a little more difficult to find information on them. They're not required to be transparent. So they probably would have done better if they had made the choice to be transparent. And so our second test case was a large public company. Overall, they did better in the areas of innovation, agility, and equity. We found 2 transformative agreements, also a public statement supporting open access policies. In the area of agility, they also made health sciences information available during the pandemic. And we, in the area of equity, we found DEI statements online. We found women in top leadership positions. There wasn't any clarity about BIPOC representation within that number, but they were above and beyond regarding accessibility. They scored very highly there. In collaboration, they were more in the mid-range. Unclear if they have academic advisory boards, and they do have some other boards that do include librarians. We found that they were in our mid-range in the areas of stewardship and service. In the area of stewardship, they were working to become a sustainable and to have a sustainable and positive impact. We found positive reviews on Glassdoor by their current and former employees. And we also found nothing obviously problematic in company investments. In the area of service, we found local community service. And also they were supportive of researchers in developing countries as well. So they also fell within that mid-range. The only area that they did not do as well in was in the area of integrity. There was a troubling history of conflicts with editorial boards, but we did not find any major lawsuits in Lexis Uni as well. So those were our 2 test cases. So that's the end of our presentation so far. We want to move into the question phase, and we would really love to hear from vendors as well as everyone else. But what do vendors think of this type of evaluation, if we have any here? And is this the type of information that you would be willing to share with your customers as well? Do you feel comfortable with that? Do you feel any obligation to do that? So we welcome any questions at this point.
Hi, this is Jennifer, your virtual facilitator. There is a comment in the Pathable chat from Chris Palazzolo. I think this is somewhat challenging due to the sometimes inelastic and monopoly of information, which you did address. However, with that said, I think this is a very valuable rubric and criteria. There are good criteria to note, even with long-standing resources. In addition, could be certainly good for newer information sources / vendors, particularly when there are similar resources.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. it is a real problem when there are not alternative sources from which we can get this information, and that vendor is problematic. We do see this in business quite a bit. We as academics are not the primary consumer for most of the databases we work with as business librarians. So the leverage we can place on people is very different than a primarily academic educational type of vendor. But I do think it's important to have these conversations and to let them know regardless that these are things that we care about and these are things we're concerned with. And if a competitor comes around who has a product that will meet this need and yet aligns more directly with our values, probably going to switch over to them, right? So I think it is important to have those conversations.
Brian Erb says, I was surprised to see no value referencing viewpoint diversity, open inquiry, or pursuit of truth. Do you see any conflict between the ideological framing of critical librarianship and viewpoint diversity? Do you think critical librarianship as a value might risk to imposing a political litmus test?
So we did not create this rubric based on our personal values as librarians. And I think that's the key piece here. We based it on our institutional values. So while the three of us really do care a lot about and try and view things through that lens of critical librarianship, that is not a stated value of our institution, right? It is not a stated value of the libraries or of Purdue. So that wasn't necessarily considered in creating this rubric because we did not find it in those value statements. So that would be, I think, more of a conversation for our next strategic plan, right? To bring that in and have those conversations at that point to actually change the values of the libraries rather than modifying a rubric. Does that?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yep. In the room, you got a question?
Yep. What did we do about the small private company? Honestly, this is a very recent project and we haven't made decisions yet. So Danielle's no longer at Purdue, but Dave and I are taking our results from this to our next Information Resources Council meeting to present our findings while we consider renewals. So, yeah. Okay, so the question was, do our expectations change if it's a large company with a ton of employees or a small company with like 5 employees? Probably to an extent, yes. I don't want to hog the mic here, but it's right in front of my face. I think that in terms, again, when you're a small 5-person company, you're going to be a private company. And so it's just going to be harder to find that information. And I think that would be part of any conversation that we're having. So while like arbitrarily, if we're just doing a rubric, a smaller company might score lower as we're going through that process. Again, it's not meant to be prescriptive. So that would be part of the conversation we had. Like if when Dave and I have this conversation with our group that makes these renewal decisions, like, well, you know, they didn't score well in this, but also there's 5 people over there. So maybe they just haven't done this yet, or it's a brand new vendor and they haven't done this yet. And again, it would be a conversation we would have with the vendor also. So, you know, theoretically, a small 5-person company is still growing and still figuring things out. And I think it would be probably helpful to them to know what we're looking at, right? Like, which is, again, why we brought this to Charleston. Yeah.
I would also add that a smaller company might have this stuff figured out internally. They just haven't figured out how to make it public yet. They don't have the same channels of communication that some of the larger ones do. So that's something we can talk about with them.
Are you ready for another virtual question?
We've got another one in the room real quick.
Okay.
The question is, how much of our findings would we be willing to share? I don't know that we want to publish findings.
Not about specific companies.
No, I think there are probably conversations that we would have with people individually. but we're also not trying to throw any vendors under the bus, right? We want this to be a partnership where we all learn from one another and can hopefully all improve. And there was actually a comment in Pathable about how many of our own institutions would fail this values rubric. Correct. Like we certainly don't meet all of our own institutional values at every level. So yeah. All right, we can do an online one now.
Sunshine Carter says, what resources, renewals, purchases do you run through the rubric? How much time did it take to gather this data for each company? And if something rates poorly for all parameters, but you must still subscribe because it's considered essential for researchers, how would you proceed?
So in terms of time, we did kind of divide and conquer on this, right? As the business librarian, I did the pieces where we would need to dig through annual reports or dig up those investment pieces, right? And Dave and Danielle looked through the contracts and talked to our e-resources librarian and our assistant dean for collections and access. Her title's changed several times. Sorry, Rebecca. So time to go through it, probably a few hours, I think was probably about right. What was the rest of that question?
How much time did it take to get this data? If something rates poorly for all parameters, but you still must subscribe.
Yeah, then it's just a conversation. If something rates poorly, as was mentioned earlier, often there's a monopoly of information. And if it's something that, for example, my business school needs for accreditation, I can't not subscribe to it, right? Like I don't have that kind of flexibility, but I think it is a good way to bring that to the vendor and have a conversation like, look, what's going on over there? Are you happy with your job, right? Things are clearly bad. So I think it's also a good conversation starter in that regard. But we would, as librarians who work in the type of system that we do, sometimes you just have to subscribe to something regardless of their business practices, unfortunately.
That's a great segue into Meg Ecclestone's question. I'm wondering if you've also applied these sorts of standards and assessments to the content of databases, especially topics like diversity and representation, problematic search algorithms, etc.
Okay, great. Perfect.
We made specifically made the decision to focus on business, our business relationships, because there already is so much in the literature where people are assessing collections regarding EDI and different issues like that. So we saw that there was a gap here in this area. So we chose to focus on that. But we have found, I found another article that was published this year where another group at a university did an assessment of business relationships based on their status as a Hispanic serving institution. And so along those values as well. So hopefully this conversation will start to happen, but we specifically chose to focus on our business relationships around acquisitions and collections in that way.
I would also point out that this is just our rubric. We encourage you to create your own based on your own institution's values. And if you want to dig into that stuff, let us know how it goes.
And I've also seen a couple of questions in the chat here if we're going to post our slides, and we can do a quick cleanup right after this of our Google slides. Got a bunch of stuff at the end to delete, and then I'll post them in the chat, and I'll also tweet them out. My Twitter is hiding Heather. So
I did want to share, we did have one publisher respond earlier to your question. As someone new to publishing, I think it's so important that we may be open about where we stand. That was from Paige.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paige.
And Viva is working on something similar at a value metric.
Oh, excellent. That's exciting.
Lots of thank yous in the chat.
I would say it's not terribly surprising that a lot of us are thinking about this. We just need to start thinking about this publicly.
Yeah, this is 100% from conversations that we've had, right? Like we're already doing this type of assessment, just not in any sort of systemic way or standardized way. Although the gold mine was really surprising. Yes, the comment was getting a rubric is so librarian. It absolutely is a rubric for all things. Awesome. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you all so much for coming in person. Those of you here in the room, and for all of you online, thank you so much as well. We really appreciate it. Thanks.